Good morning, everyone, and welcome to this edition of Ramblings of an Old Fart podcast. And this is Craig Warren. I wanted to talk a little bit today about, of course, we had the 4th of July yesterday. We had a big celebration. But I read some articles that were very unfavorable to our founding fathers, Thomas Jefferson, a lot of those that think that they completely ignored the black population, the slaves at that time. And I want to go through it and show you that that is absolutely not true. They recognized slavery as a problem, and they tried to fix it immediately, right at the time they were working on signing the Constitution in 1787. So I just kind of want to go through a little bit of the history of that. I titled this, Were Black People Really as Invisible to Our Founders as Many Would Have You Believe? And I think I can prove otherwise. So let's find out exactly who actually started the slave trade in North America. A lot of people think the United States were responsible for this. The truth is, the United States didn't even exist when the transatlantic slave trade started, when it came to North America. The truth is, the first recorded enslaved Africans were brought to Jamestown, Virginia in 1619 aboard a Dutch pirate ship, though Spanish and Portuguese had been trafficking enslaved people to the Americas and the Caribbean as early as the 1500s. So the slave trade did not start with the United States of America. It was already here. So we just have to understand that. For over 150 years before the Declaration of Independence, the American colonies operated under British imperial law. Which aggressively expanded the legally institutionalized chattel slavery. They wanted the slaves to maximize colonial output for the empire. The economic system the colonies that they set up in the colony is mercantilism. Under this system, the colonies were strictly designed to be a giant resource extraction farm for the British Crown. The British Parliament passed laws like the Navigation Acts, the Iron Act, and the Wool Act to ensure that colonies could never manufacture their own goods. It was illegal to export colonial-made textiles or compete with British factories. See, the raw materials, the indigo, the tobacco, and later cotton, were produced in the colonies using intensive labor shipped directly to British textile mills in places like Manchester, England, and then manufactured into goods, and then those finished goods were then shipped back to the colonies and sold to the colonists at premium prices. That's why we had slaves. That was to help the British Crown. The result, though, this system intentionally forced the southern colonial economy to become completely dependent on large-scale agricultural production, which the British fueled with the slave trade. It deliberately choked out the development of a diverse, self-sufficient economy in the United States or in America. The question is why couldn't slavery have been abolished instantly in 1776? The argument that the country would not have survived an immediate outright abolition of slavery at its founding is backed up by the brutal political realities of the 1787 Constitutional Convention. The fragile union of the 13 colonies was held together by a thread. The economies of South Carolina, Georgia, North Carolina were so completely dependent on slave labor that their delegates explicitly stated that they would refuse to join the United States if slavery was abolished or if the slave trade was banned immediately. There would have been no United States of America. The founders faced a grim, pragmatic calculation. It comes down to the math sometimes. They could demand total abolition and watch the southern states form a separate alliance, potentially partnering with Britain or Spain, which would have crushed the young republic. Or they could compromise on slavery to preserve the Union, hoping the institution would eventually die out. They chose the Union. But here's the thing I want to go into. This is what they chose. But I want to show you the reasons that they chose it and why they thought it was the best option. The founders' relationship with slavery was marked by intense hypocrisy and guilt and political maneuvering. We all know that. They were not blind to black people, though. They were acutely aware of the moral contradiction that they were living. I know I hear a lot of people commenting about Thomas Jefferson, how he wrote the right to life and liberty, all this stuff in the Declaration of Independence. But I want you to hear what he said about this. He was the ultimate embodiment of the American paradox. He authored the words "all men are created equal" in all of that stuff, while owning more than 600 enslaved people throughout his lifetime. In his notes in the state of Virginia in 1781, he expressed terror over the eventual consequences of slavery. He said, "I tremble for my country when I reflect that God is just, that his justice cannot sleep forever." Yeah. He knew we were going to pay a price for that, and he recognized it. Now, here's the issue. We don't give him credit sometimes in other ways because there is a clause in the original Declaration of Independence that was stricken before it was accepted as the final draft. In his original draft of the Declaration of Independence, Jefferson explicitly blamed King George III for the slave trade, calling it a cruel war against human nature itself, violating the most sacred rights of life and liberty. The Continental Congress struck this section out to appease the South Carolina and Georgia. So he tried to do the best he could with what he had, and so did others like him. George Washington's views evolved significantly during the Revolutionary War, largely because he commanded black soldiers who fought bravely for the American independence. In 1786, a letter to John Francis Mercer, he stated, "I never mean to possess another slave by purchase, it being my first wishes to see some plan adopted by which slavery in this country may be abolished by slow, sure, and imperceptible degrees." So even before our Constitution was signed, these people were trying to figure out ways to abolish it. They didn't bring it here. This was brought here by Britain and Spain and France and all kinds of other people. Washington was the only major Virginian founding father to free the enslaved people he owned in his will. And that happened, they were to be either freed or emancipated after his wife Martha passed away. He wanted to make sure she had someone to take care of her. The Northern founders were largely opposed to slavery, though they still compromised politically to keep the South in the Union. John Adams, he never owned slaves, and he refused to lose slave labor on principle. He wrote, "I have through my whole life held the practice of slavery in such abhorrence that I have never owned a Negro or any other slave." Benjamin Franklin, on the other hand, had owned a few slaves, just household slaves kind of a thing, to help out around there. But he became the president of the Pennsylvania Society for Promoting the Abolition of Slavery, and in 1790 signed a petition to Congress demanding the immediate conversion of African Americans into free men and the end of the slave trade. Of course, that didn't fly. The southern states voted that down. Of course they did. To keep this simple and direct and complete, we have to look at the 1787 Constitutional Convention. But we have to look not as a philosophical debate, but as a high-stakes business negotiation, because that's really, truly what it ended up being. You see, you have 55 delegates, and they knew that they couldn't agree that the United States would work if we split into small groups, right? We had to try and keep it together to keep this nation going. They all felt some degree of I don't exactly the right word, but they all felt that it should stay together. We shouldn't divide it up. However, the southern states, the Deep South, they had the ultimate leverage because You know, they had all the slaves. They had all the votes. They could control Congress through the House of Representatives. And they basically came right out and said, give us what we want or we walk. We already talked a little bit about that. So to prevent the country from collapsing before it even got started, the North and South made 3 major brutal compromises. And trust me, people like Jefferson and those, they compromised on this knowing full well they was horrible things. But they did so to protect and hopefully that the United States of America could actually get started and continue, because they felt it would be one of the greatest countries in the world in support of freedom and liberty. The first one, and a lot of people get this wrong. I know a lot of black people, I don't think they fully understand this. It's what they call the 3/5 compromise, the battle over political power. The biggest fight on this wasn't morality of slavery or anything like that. It was about the voting power in Congress. The population determined how many seats a state gets in the House of Representatives. We all know this. The South wanted to count enslaved people as full persons. It's not indicating the humanity of it, that they were somehow less. It was just the sheer count for the population count to determine representation. Okay, so the North didn't want that to happen because they knew that that would give them an unusually high numbers in the House of Representatives and give them basically an unfair advantage. But they argued that the slaves were legally considered property in the South and they shouldn't be counted for political representation at all. And that's where the fight began. So eventually they compromised by counting 3 out of every 5 enslaved individuals. I like that terminology better, because if you say this is the 3/5, we're not counting them as 3/5 a person. It's just that only 3 out of every 5 of the enslaved individuals would be counted to determine representation. Contrary to popular belief, this wasn't a statement on human worth. This is what I said. It was a cold political calculation. It prevented the South from gaining total control of the federal government, but it still gave slave states disproportionate power in Congress, at least for the immediate future. The second thing they did, they were able to negotiate with the South a 20-year deadline. 1787, they agreed, all the states, that the slave trade would cease after 1808. All right, that would be 20 years. But the Deep South and Carolina, they were losing people to disease and everything like that. So they at least wanted to keep that border open for a little while. They tried to get it immediate, but that failed. So the 20-year rule came into play. Of course, the North wanted the power to abolish it completely. We talked about that. But so anyway, this a lot of people just think this was not good enough, but it was all they could do at the time. The South used those 20 years to traffic hundreds, maybe even millions into the country more before the ban ended out. Came due, basically, that time period that cut off. They also, this is one that really, really troubled a lot of the people like Thomas Jefferson, the fugitive slave cause, which meant that any fugitive slaves that they crossed over into the North or anywhere, that they couldn't be considered free. They had to be returned to their owners in the South. They had a real hard time with that one, but it was a necessity at the time. The founders didn't ignore slavery because black people were invisible to them. They considered they were protecting them because the Union was fragile. The Northern delegates detested the compromises, but they believed a flawed Union was better than no Union at all. They made a wager with history, hoping that if they locked the system down for the moment, slavery would naturally die out on its own. But instead, it took 74 years later and a civil war. But I want to understand here why the founders like Jefferson made the decision they did. By forcing the compromise down to 3/5, the North successfully diluted the South's voting power. It kept the door open for free states to eventually outvote the slave states as the population of the North grew. At the time of the founding, northern states were in the middle of passing gradual abolition laws already, which freed enslaved people over time rather than all at once. Because of this, the northern black population was a mix of free citizens and people still held in bondage. By 1790, of course, that was the first census, there was already over 27,000 free black Americans living in the North, in cities like Philadelphia, Boston, and New York. They made up a district rapidly growing segment of the urban population. And here's the thing. The freed black Americans in northern cities weren't just surviving, they were building an economic foothold. Because of radical prejudices, they were kept out of some things. That was still there a little bit. But they did have opportunities here. And that's what I want to talk to you a little bit about. Many of them had jobs like as dock workers, shipbuilders, and sailors in ports like Boston and Philadelphia. A massive percentage of the merchant marine crews were free black men. Surprisingly enough, it didn't matter what color your skin was. If you did the job, you got to travel the world and they got paid the same as anybody else. Not only that, black communities boasted highly skilled blacksmiths, shoemakers, tailors, carpenters, and barbers. So they were building lives for themselves. Some of them even became quite wealthy. We had a man named James Forten. He was a Revolutionary War veteran who became the master sailmaker. He ran a major integrated workforce and became one of the wealthiest men in Philadelphia. He later used his fortune to help fund the Underground Railroad and early abolitionist newspapers. We had a man named Paul Cuff, which was a free black man, but he was free and Native American. He became a highly successful sea captain and ship owner. In 1780, he famously petitioned the Massachusetts government, arguing that if free blacks were going to be taxed, they must have the right to vote. No taxation without representation. That sounds like the same argument we used against the British, doesn't it? Also, because white society still barred black citizens from the standard civic institutions, churches, schools, insurance society, those problems hadn't been fixed yet. Okay, we all understand that. But the free black community built their own. They created some of these organizations and became the operational hubs for the early civil rights movement. In 1787, the exact same year the white founders were down the street writing the U.S. Constitution, Allen and Jones formed the Free African Society. It was a mutual aid society that acted like an insurance company, providing financial support to widows, orphans, and the sick. When a catastrophic yellow fever epidemic crippled Philadelphia in 1793, the Free African Society stepped up to organize the city's nursing and burial services when a lot of the white authorities abandoned the city and fled. Allen went on to found the African Methodist Episcopal Church, creating the first independent black religious denomination in America. See, all these things were happening at the time we were signing the Constitution, or slightly after. And then we have a man named Prince Hall, a free leather worker. He was a free black man, a leather worker, and a Revolutionary War veteran also. Hall wanted to join the local Freemasons, but was rejected because of his race. So what did he do? He went directly to the Grand Lodge of England and secured a charter in 1787 to form the African Lodge number 459, now known as Prince Hall Freemasonry. It became a powerful network for free black men to organize politically, push for education for black children, and fight against the slave trade. Founded in 1787 by a New York manumission society, the school was created to educate children. That's the African Free School in New York City. It went on to produce some of the most influential black intellects, doctors, and abolitionists of the 19th century. Problem was, see, what I'm trying to paint a picture of here, Thomas Jefferson and those who made those compromises that they absolutely hated did so because they believed that slavery was already on its way out. You know, we already had the northern and southern states that were shedding slaves because their crops were failing because they had over-farmed, didn't use very smart tactics. The labor was cheap, so they didn't really care. So that was already tapering off, and he assumed that it would continue that way. So he figured by this 1808 deadline, slavery would already be on its way out, and it would be in an organized fashion so that it wouldn't be all at once. Problem is, you can't see into the future. All you can do is make your judgments and decisions based on what you currently see and what the past, recent past is showing you. Problem was, in 1793, a man named Eli Whitney invented a machine, the cotton gin, right? Suddenly, overnight basically, a single cotton gin could clean 50 pounds of cotton in a single day, where typically it would take a slave pretty much all day even to maybe get 1 pound or maybe 2 pounds tops if they were really good. So all of a sudden, this one machine could do what 50 slaves could do, right? So it might take maybe 1 or 2 slaves to run it, but it would do the work of 50 slaves. So you'd think, well, man, maybe we don't need the slavery anymore, but no. They got greedy. Instead of making labor obsolete, the cotton gin made slave labor infinitely more valuable because a planter now could process cotton at lightning speed. The only limit to their wealth was how much cotton they could plant and pick. So now, because the international slave trade was banned by 1808, thanks to that 20-year deadline, Southern planters couldn't legally import new labor from Africa. But that didn't stop them. See, as Thomas Jefferson foreseen, that the need for slaves in the northern southern states like Virginia and North Carolina had tapered off. Now they just began buying up all the excess slaves from there, marching them down to the southern states and putting them to work clearing land so they could plant more cotton. That's something that Jefferson and others who wanted to abolish slavery did not foresee. You can't blame them for that. They did the best they could with the information they had. Like I said, the founders made their compromise in 1787, assuming that the economic gears of slavery would naturally grind to a halt. But 6 years later, we have the cotton gin, and that changed the whole game. If Eli Whitney had never invented the cotton gin, or the slave trade had stopped at 1808, things would have been radically different, likely resembling the gradual emancipation tracks that the northern states were already doing, and then also the British Empire. So it wasn't long after this time frame that the British Empire also abolished their slavery system, but they did it in an organized manner. They weren't foolish and wait till it turned into a civil war. Without the cotton gin, human labor would have remained economically inefficient for large-scale farming, as the tobacco and indigo and rice continued to exhaust the soil. Slaveholders would have faced a massive financial crisis, right? They would have owned millions of people they didn't, they had to feed and clothe and house, but they didn't have a crop that was profitable enough to do so. Because of this economic pressure, the South almost certainly would have been forced to adopt gradual emancipation laws. Instead of freeing millions of slaves and millions of people overnight, the laws would have dictated that, say, for instance, anyone born in slavery after a certain year would be freed upon reaching adulthood, kind of things like that. But the slow transition would have given the economy decades to adjust. It would have allowed free black communities to form, gradually buy land, establish schools, all of the stuff that they were already starting to do in the North. But instead, the cotton gin made slavery the most profitable industry in the country, meaning it had to be violently ripped out by war. When the Civil War ended in 1865, 4 million people were freed instantly, or reasonably close to instantly. Completely devastated, and they were turned loose into a hostile southern economy that was absolutely destroyed. Because it happened as a chaotic military necessity rather than a planned social transition, there was no land distribution, no financial safety net, and no legal protection. This lack of a plan forced millions of newly freed people straight into sharecropping as a system that legally and financially bound them back to a lot of the same plantations that they were supposedly freed from. And many of them stayed there for decades until things changed where they could work their way out of it. The alternate irony here is these same Southerners that fought to keep slavery successfully protected their immediate wealth, completely blind to the fact that by refusing a gradual exit strategy, like in 1787, they were setting a countdown timer. They were countdown timer. They were setting the old stopwatch here. 74 years after they signed that document, the very system they fought to anchor into the Constitution caused the spark that burned the Old South to the ground. The 1% of the ultra-wealthy Southern plantation owners, men like the Pinckneys and the Rutherfords, held immense political and economic power. Even though 84% of Americans never did own any slaves, had anything to do with it, that small planter class was wealthy enough, organized enough, and stubborn enough to threaten to destroy the United States before it ever got started. And that's my message today. We need to look at these men a little bit differently. They knew that they had been part of something horrible. It's not something they started. They realized it. They tried to do something about it. And I think they did everything they possibly could. And who knows what would happen if the United States never actually got started. Where would we be? Where would this land be today? Would this be like Eastern Europe when you got like 40, 50 different little small states? Who knows? I don't think it would be as good as what we have now. Anyway, I'm going to leave that with you today. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope you found it entertaining and enlightening and educational. I hope you join me next time. And this is Craig Warren with the Ramblings in the Old Fart Podcast. Until next time, God bless and keep you.